Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about working memory and the importance associated with this concept of working memory and why it's useful for us. Now, to get into this idea of working memory and to begin to really fully understand what working memory is all about, we have to visit a little bit about the history of memory. And to be able to do that, we have to look at precursors to working memory or components associated with working memory that entail the ability to be able to work on information. So thus we need to visit with short-term memory. We'll also then be talking about working memory, and then we're going to conclude our discussion with a brief introduction to long-term memory, since next week we will be visiting that issue of long-term memory a little bit more closely. So the idea here is the following. What happens with information whenever it is that we begin to process it? So remember, we have our 4 steps in the perceptual process. And remember, with our 4 steps in the perceptual process, what do they include? Number one, we have the stimulus, right? So we have the stimulus. If I can write stimulus, there we go. Number two, we have electricity occur. Number three, we have prior knowledge that is then activated, and we're going to have an action. And then step number 4 is that we're going to create knowledge. Right? So we have already talked a little bit about the precursors to all of this, of all of these issues, except for really this part here about knowledge or the creation of what we now consider to be memory. So we've talked about the stimulus being out there in the world. We've talked about electricity being created. We talked about accessing information associated with what it is that we've done in the past, so that way we can have appropriate action, and the importance of attention within this whole realm, that without attention, I'm never going to be able to process the stimulus anyways, so it's important for me to focus my attention. And why is it that I need to be able to focus my attention? Well, essentially what I want is I want to get a step number 4. So again, if we're information processors, what's our point? Our point is to take in information and do something with it. So we're going to create knowledge, we're going to create memories, and we're going to work with that information later on in our lives, right? So later on when something happens that is similar to a situation that we've had in our past, we're going to be able to have an according action that's going to correspond adequately to that specific situation. So part of what I have to do is I have to get information from the world into my memory bank. How am I going to do that? Well, essentially, it's going to go through this process that we're going to go through short-term memory, we're going to go through working memory, and then we're going to have it be in long-term memory. So what we want to do is we want to create knowledge. We want to create memory. Now, how are we going to create that memory? We're going to create it through a very, very delicate process, and we're going to go today through that process and why it's so important for us. So before we begin our introduction to talking about working memory and this idea of trying to get information into permanent store, let's revisit a little bit in terms of where it is that we have the history of memory. Now, we've already talked about this on our introductory lecture for the course. But again, just to kind of reiterate some of these issues, Aristotle really began to think about this idea of memory and even wrote a book of memory and recollection to discuss this particular issue associated with memory and why it's so important. So he was really the first to ever develop metaphors for memory, again talking about this idea of that we have this piece of wax, that some individuals have hard wax, some individuals have soft wax, and essentially what we're trying to do is make impressions in our tablet so that way we can have that memory then be created and we can access and look at that information later on. Now again, those individuals with soft wax, people who are easily able to make memories, for them it's going to be a lot easier to be able to make those impressions because their wax is soft, and here it's going to leave a nice impression with a lot of details. Other people who have hard wax, so it's very hard for them to memorize information or to create these memories, for them it's going to take a lot more effort and a lot more elaboration in terms of processing of that stimulus, so that way we can have a good detailed memory that's going to be created. So ultimately, what are we really looking at here in terms of these ideas of what Aristotle was telling us? Well, essentially, people are going to be different. But in reality, we all still have the same cognitive architecture in terms of our design, that we all still have short-term memory, we all still have working memory, we all still have long-term memory for normal individuals. Now, granted, there are going to be situations where there are abnormal cases that neurologically speaking, there may be potential deficits or there may be brain damage that may have created some aspects associated with short-term loss, with working memory loss, or even with long-term memory loss. And we'll discuss a couple of those this week and also next week with our discussion of long-term memory. But it is very important for us to understand that we are working with normal individuals. So we're going to assume that we also have the exact same cognitive architecture in that sense, that we have short-term working memory and also long-term memory in these particular cases. So when we think about memory, there's really two dominant theories associated with how memory works. The two theories here that we're going to introduce and that your textbook introduces and does a very good job of discussing both of these theories are, number one, Atkins and Shiffrin's model of short-term memory, and essentially how it is that we process information from one point to another. So in other words, how do we get information from point A to point B? And that's really a fundamental issue for us to consider. So if information is out there in my world, how do I get that information that's out there in the world to be in my long-term memory store? Because essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to process that information for very short periods of time, because remember, our attention is going to be like a spotlight, so it moves from stimulus to stimulus or from area to area in my visual field or in my auditory field or whatever the case may be. But since my attention is shifting drastically all the time, I need to be able to hold information in for very short periods of time, such as what we have with short-term memory, and then move that information into long-term memory. Because what I essentially want to do is I want to hold that information in there for as long as I can and essentially store it so that I can access it later on. Let that be hours, days, months, years later, but ultimately I want to be able to access this information. So again, going back to our idea of our computer, or this metaphor of how we function a lot like a computer, or I should say how a computer functions like us, imagine as us trying to save information onto a flash drive, but what happens when you're working on a document on your computer, but you don't press Control S? So one of the things that the computer can do is they can create, one of those emergency temporary files that if your computer shuts down, you're able to re-access the information, at least the one that was previously saved, or at least the one that was moderately recovered from the system earlier on in the process of the completion of the document, but the one file that you actually wanted, the completed version of that information, you did not save it adequately to the hard drive or to your flash drive. So thus, what ends up happening? Well, the computer essentially is holding that information for a given period of time in its processor, and then hopefully what you should do is you should be able to save that information into your flash drive or into your hard drive so that way it can be in the permanent store. The permanent store of your hard drive or this flash drive is going to then function like your long-term memory store. So ultimately what Atkins and Shiffrin essentially talked to us about in terms of this specific model was that we have to have some type of system that essentially sends information from the sensory input, right? So in other words, we have the stimulus that's occurring in nature, and then we're going to send that information through, we're going to process on that information for a short period of time, we're going to work on it, and then we're going to send that information through to get stored for an infinite period of time, or at least what we would consider to be an infinite period of time, because that is one of the major debates that we currently have in our field as to what is long-term memory and how long is long-term memory. Now, our second dominant theory that we have associated with how memory works is this idea that was given to us by Alan Baddeley. So back in the 70s and 80s, Alan Baddeley worked on this idea that we would have what's called a working memory component associated with the transmission of information from short-term to long-term memory. So essentially what Alan Baddeley talked about was that we would have this mechanism that essentially allowed us to work on information at the short-term period point, as Atkins and Shiffrin had pointed out. So in other words, we're holding information that's currently being used at that point, but now we're going to work on it according to Alan Baddeley. So during this time that we're holding the information in short-term memory, we're going to work on that information, and the more that we work on that information, that we keep it in our conscious awareness, so in other words, we're paying attention to that stimulus, the higher the likelihood that it's going to go into our long-term or our permanent store in this particular case. Now, Alan Baddeley discussed the idea of working memory model in 4 components. The 4 components that Alan Baddeley proposed it in were number 1, the phonological loop, number 2, the visual spatial sketchpad, number 3, the central executive, and number 4, the episodic buffer. We are going to visit all 4 of these components of working memory model, and we're also going to talk for a little bit in terms of the theory that was proposed to us by Atkins and Shiffrin in terms of this multi-model of memory. So we're going to visit this in just a couple of moments here. So if we think about this idea of what we're trying to memorize, so in other words, what are we trying to commit into knowledge? Well, ultimately, what I'm trying to commit into knowledge or commit into my memory is essentially all my sensory experiences or all the sensory input that's existing out there in the world. So in other words, I have all this environmental stimuli that's existing out there in the world, and what I want to try to do is I want to process as much of that information that I possibly can and store that for later usage. So in other words, I'm going to store information on my flash drive or on my hard drive, and then later on, whenever it is that I'm working on something that's similar to it, I should be able to go into my flash drive, activate that file, extract information that is relevant, match it up, and be able to use it appropriately in that new situation that I'm in. So even though that new situation may be a little bit different than the situation where I originally learned that information in, I'm still going to assume that it's going to be relevant in this particular case. So ultimately, we assume here that to be able to actually memorize, right, if we put memorize in quotes, or to be able to process this sensory experience or the sensory input that is coming in from our world, we can do this in 3 stages. The first stage is essentially to work on it at what we call the sensory memory representation stage. So ultimately, with sensory memory, all that we're doing here is we have this stimulus that exists out in the world coming into my sensory system. So we've talked about this already numerous times throughout the semester and all of the previous lectures, that we have the stimulus existing out there in the world. It's coming in through my sensory system, so let that be my eyes, my nose, my mouth, my hands that I'm touching the object, or my ears. So ultimately here, it doesn't really matter what sensory system I'm using, as long as that physical stimulus exists and it's activating one of my sensory systems. So here, once it activates that sensory system is going to try now to begin to work on that information a little bit for us. All right, so that's the idea of sensory memory. So here we're going to start now trying to pay attention to this information that's given to us there, because my sensory system is saying something is here and I now want to begin to pay attention to it and try to work on it at least a little bit here. So I want to create some type of representation of that initial stimulus. Now, the second stage, or the second point in terms of our model, is going to be the short-term memory component. Now, remember here that Alan Baddeley proposed that working memory was going to be a component associated with short-term memory. So working memory is not necessarily short-term memory, but working memory falls under short-term memory. So it's a subcomponent of short-term memory. So here, during the short-term memory period, we're holding information for very short periods of time, and hopefully what we're going to do during this short period of time is that we're going to begin to work on that information. Now, how short is short? Short can be milliseconds, it can be seconds, but we're not here talking about minutes, we're not even talking 30, 40 seconds. So here we're talking for very short periods of time. So here we're talking about these very short periods of time that we're going to be able to process this information, and that we're trying to attenuate and maintain my attention on the specific stimulus that exists out there in the world. So ultimately, what do I want to try to do? I want to try to focus my attention as much as I can, shine that spotlight on that object, or try to make sure that I can shine that spotlight of audition onto the words that are being spoken, and really try to understand what they're saying and really try to understand what the meaning is behind those words. So here, focusing in on specific information and ignoring other pieces of the puzzle that are out there. So thus, I can work on it and be able to then send it over into long-term memory. Now, what is it that we're going to be able to send into long-term memory? Well, that's going to be highly dependent on how much information it is that I can work with. Now, one of the things that we're going to be able to see, and I'm going to bring up an example of this, is that at the beginning of the semester, I gave you guys a list of words. So I asked you guys as one of your participation points, so you're going to see this list of words, so bed, rest, awake, so on and so forth. And then I asked you guys to be able to recall them. So go back in and select which items it is that you actually were able to use, or that you identified as having seen before, that you wrote down on your list. So ultimately here, we're going to assume then that there's going to be some information that went into your long-term memory, but yet there's going to be some information that's still remaining at the short-term memory part. And here we're going to talk about the differences between those two using that participation point that we just that we did a couple of weeks back. So I'm going to present you guys with your results. So ultimately, when we're looking at this point of what's actually going to be going through, it's going to depend on lots of different factors. And one of those primary factors is how much information am I potentially working on. So here, imagine a scenario where we're tossing objects at you, right? So I'm tossing an object at you and you catch it, right? So it's one individual object and you're able to catch it, and you catch it, and you catch it, and that's great. But then what happens when we start throwing a lot more objects at you? So we start throwing 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 objects at you. Well, it starts getting a lot more complicated to be able to catch all of them and juggle them, right? So ultimately, you're going to be able to keep up with it to a certain degree, but then there's going to be this point where it's just too much information that we're tossing at you that it's probably just going to fall away and decay. So ultimately, what is it then that's going to go into long-term memory? Well, it's going to be what you were able to catch. Not everything is going to be able to go in because we weren't able to work on everything, because unfortunately sometimes it's going to depend greatly on our memory span. And here I'm going to introduce this idea of 7 plus or minus 2 to you that George Miller proposed for us back in the 50s. But ultimately it was this idea that we can only hold on to a specific limit of information while we have information at the short-term memory, at the working memory component part. Okay, so we have limits to what it is that we can process, right, in terms of our units or in terms of our items. So ultimately here, what is it that's going to go into long-term memory? Some of the puzzle, but not all of the puzzle. So here, this is going to assume that we're going to be holding information for longer than 30 to 45 seconds here. If you can process information between 30 to 45 seconds, there's a high likelihood that it's going to go into long-term memory. Now, how long is long-term memory? For how long will it be there? We really don't know the answer to that, because to be honest, we don't have empirical evidence to suggest that there's this time frame that, well, if you learned it 15 years ago and you've never used it, then it's going to go away. So this whole idea of if you don't use it, you lose it in terms of memory is not necessarily accurate, because for instance, let's say that you haven't ridden a bicycle in 15 years. If that were true, that if you don't use it, you lose it, the very first time that you would get on a bicycle, it would just be impossible to ride it. But yet you still kind of are able to ride the bicycle, but you may have some trouble. But again, it may take 1 or 2 or even 3 attempts, and then you're able to ride the bicycle adequately, and you're like, oh, yep, now I remember. Well, if we actually had information just completely be forgotten, and we actually had information being lost because we had to make space for other files or other new memories, then we would assume that if you haven't used that information and now you're engaging in that task, you would have to relearn the entire task again. And here you would have to start from scratch all the way back up to your expertise level that you are currently at. So unfortunately, we really don't think about our memory store as being this place where we're going to just completely forget about information and that we're never going to be able to use it again. That is just completely lost, but rather it's going to be hidden away, and we're going to talk about that hidden aspect and how it is that we can actually bring back some of that information. Now, in terms of the size of long-term memory, how much size do we also have? That's a very, very debatable question. To be honest, again, that's an answer that we really don't know. That's a question that we don't know the answer to, is what I should be saying here. So ultimately, we really don't know if our memory bank is only going to hold 64 gigabytes or 1 terabyte or 100 terabytes. We really don't know. We haven't really been able to find the limit in terms of human memory for what people can memorize. And a part of that is really this idea that, well, we're really not memorizing every single thing that's out there in the world. So we're not saving every single object, every single word. We're not saving every single piece of clothing that an individual is wearing, but rather we may be able to create prototypes of what was said or what the person was wearing or what we saw, and thus just kind of fill in some of that information. And again, we'll talk a little bit about this as to how we fill in information and how we can actually make our memories and long-term memories also change. So if we look at the multi-store model of memory, what does it really look like if we were going to have a graphical representation? This is what my multi-store model of memory would look like. So at the initial stage here that we have, we're going to have the environmental input or the stimulus occur, right? So here, for instance, think of it as you are walking through the street and all of a sudden you see a bird, right? So you look at the bird, and now what is it that you want to do? You're going to convert the physical stimuli, the physical properties associated with the stimulus that we have here, we're going to convert it into energy, right? So in other words, once it hits my sensory system, the receptors in my sensory system, let that be my eyes, my ears, my nose, my tongue, my hand, wherever it is that I'm thinking of in terms of that sensory system, those receptors are going to become activated and they're going to send the signal through to my brain. Now, once it is that we actually do this very quick scan of the environmental stimulus, we're going to pre-code some of that information, and hopefully what we can have during this period of time is that we can have continuous process that goes on now into working memory. So in other words, it caught my attention. I now am going to focus a little bit more on that stimulus, because I was able to scan it for its importance. Now I want to process it a little bit more. So hopefully here now I can send that information through and continue to work on it, right? So the working aspect, and maintain it for a short period of time. Now, unfortunately though, if I don't pay attention to what that stimulus was, so for instance, there's a bird out there in my world, but yet I don't pay attention, well, ultimately I may have decay occur. Now, what is decay? Decay essentially means that the object or the stimulus that I am looking at, I am not paying sufficient attention to it, so I'm not putting my sensory system on it, and I'm not able to process the physical properties associated with that stimulus. So in other words, I can still think or see that there's an object out there, but I was just quickly scanning the scene. So I was doing a saccade. I looked, I saw that there was a bird, but I kept going. I didn't really give it too much attention. So you may not even have classified it as a bird or anything. You just saw an object and you kept going. So here, what's going to happen? Well, that information with the bird is not going to be able to be worked on. So in other words, it existed in your environment, but since you didn't give it importance and you didn't give it enough of your attentional skills, it's going to decay away because that sensory stimulus here that we've created is not being paid attention enough. So in other words, it's going to decay and it's not going to be able to continue moving forward. Now, once it is that we actually have information going forward into our working or our short-term area, we're now going to really begin to rehearse that information. We're going to code and we're going to recode if necessary. Now, what does this mean for us? It essentially means that we are now going to work on this information. We're going to try to classify it appropriately. We're going to try to get information associated with what that object may potentially be. So once it is that you look at that object, you're going to want to be able to think to yourself, all right, well, it looks like an object that I may have actually seen in my past. You're working on the information, trying to get in some of those details associated with what that bird looks like. So we're going to rehearse it, and you may have to recode too. So you may have to revisit that object a couple of times so that way you make sure you got the right information. Now, what happens in the case where we may have a problem occurring at the short-term memory stage? We may have what's called displacement. Now, ultimately with displacement, unfortunately, we may have the wrong processing occurring at this time. So with displacement, essentially what may potentially happen is that we may have what we would call forgetting occur. Okay, now here again, forgetting, I'm going to say that forgetting is going to be put in quotation marks for us because for us in reality, we don't really have this aspect of forgetting. Now this is kind of like a made up term, unfortunately, that I think that we've made in our field and that the general public has kind of run away with, because many times when we think about this aspect of forgetting is like, oh, well, I forgot that information. I had it, but then I don't have it anymore. So thus, I need to relearn that information, or I need you to retell me that information so that way I can have it again. But in reality, you didn't really forget it, because once it is that somebody tells you that you missed that information, so for instance, my wife has said to me before, like, oh, you went to the grocery store, did you pick up bread? And I'm like, I forgot. So for me, essentially, what I'm telling her is, hey, you know what, you gave me information, and unfortunately, I didn't process it enough that I essentially just completely let it go, and it fell away. That's essentially what I'm trying to say to her. But I use the term forgetting. But as soon as she tells me that aspect of, well, did you remember to bring it? I did not bring it. I remembered right away that yes, she did actually tell me to bring bread. So in reality, was it something that was completely lost? And the answer is no, it wasn't lost. It was just hidden away in my memory store, and I did not access it correctly at that time where I needed that information. So in reality here, rather than us saying forgetting, really what should we be saying? We should be saying that we have faulty storage and faulty retrieval. So in other words, I did not store it correctly and I did not retrieve it correctly at the time I needed that information. So it's not that it was lost. It was not lost in terms of me having just completely ceased to have existed that information, but rather that information is just misplaced, or I just did not access that information correctly to use it in that given scenario. So here, ultimately, we need to make sure that whenever it is that we put something in to our long-term memory, because again, then that's the goal, that here we're working on this information and now we're going to go into long-term memory, that when we code that information, we rehearse and we modify that information, we put it in the right place in our long-term memory storage. So that's going to be a very, very important process for us, that once it is in our long-term memory storage, we're going to store it in the correct location, or what we assume to be in the correct location. I'm going to try to retrieve that information for later processing, and then once I retrieve that information, I can rework or recode on that information. And I should continuously be processing information that's here in my long-term memory. So accessing that information for me being able to use that information. Now, is there a problem that could potentially occur that would not allow me to recall the right information or to store information appropriately or to process information appropriately? And the answer is yes. This is where we have what's called interference. Interference essentially means that we are having problems with the retrieval aspect of it. So in other words, there are new things that are hindering our ability to remember the right information, or there are old things that we know that are hindering us from learning the new information. So in other words, we can have what's called proactive or retroactive interference, and we're going to visit those and also in just a couple of minutes here. So let's look here at our very first stage in terms of this multi-store model. Now, for our multi-store model, we're looking first at our sensory store stage. So we're looking at the sensory register here, if you want to think about it. In the sensory register, we hold information for very short periods of time here. All information needs to come in through the sensory store. And now remember, this sensory store is going to be relevant depending on the sensory system that you're using. So there's going to be a sensory store for your ears, for your taste, for your smell, for your touch, for your vision as well. So here, ultimately, we are going to be having information coming in. If information does not come in through that sensory system, it's never going to be processed. So we talked about this in last week's lecture with attention, that if I'm not paying attention and using my sensory system to look at that object or to listen for that particular sound or to taste that particular taste or to smell that smell or touch that physical object, I'm never going to be able to process that information. So here with visual information, one of the ways that we can actually create the processing of this initial state of that information is by what we call an iconic representation. Now, with an iconic representation, this refers to a representation that we make for visual information. Now, what is an iconic representation if we had to think about something? Imagine that you can close your eyes and you can think of that object that you potentially had just seen, right? So you just saw an object very, very quickly for a very brief period of time, and it produces kind of this flash, if you want, and you can see a very brief kind of outline of that object, and it essentially creates a visual representation of that image that's there. Now, for auditory information, we can produce what's called an echoic representation. Now, an echoic representation is that you can essentially hear information and you can kind of hear the echo, if you want to think about that, in terms of sensory information. So even though I'm going to be finishing my sentence right here, you can still hear some of that information. So here you can still hear that sound kind of even creating a little bit of that auditory representation for you. So whenever it is that we begin to attenuate to information, that's when processing is really going to begin. So once I allow my sensory system to be able to capture that specific stimulus that's out there in my world. Now, once it is that we process information at the sensory register, what's the next thing that we have to do? We now have to go into our short-term memory. Now, William James was really one of the first individuals to kind of ever propose this idea of short-term memory. So he proposed that we would work on information for very short periods of time. So we would hold information for just a little while, and then we would have to do something with it. If we didn't do anything with it, we were never going to be able to remember it later on. So according to William James, we have a very short duration for short-term memory. We have somewhere between 15 to 20 seconds of ability to be able to process information at the short-term memory component part. So imagine here as your spotlight is shining on that object for between 15 to 20 seconds, and then that spotlight is going to turn off and you're no longer going to be able to process it. And whatever information that you recall later on is the information that got to your long-term memory. So according to researchers, what is it that we have to do at the short-term memory spot or at the short-term memory stage? We have to diligently work for those 15 to 20 seconds to try to process as much information as we possibly can. Because here our attention is going to shift to another object. That object may also disappear. Who knows? But ultimately here we have a very, very short period of time to be able to work on that particular stimulus of interest. Now, George Miller, back in the 1950s, began to introduce to us this idea of us potentially having a capacity in terms of our limit for short-term memory. And what he proposed is this idea of 7 plus or minus 2. Now, essentially what George Miller proposed is that we as human individuals, as normal human individuals, have the ability to process about 7 plus or minus 2 units. What does that mean, 7 plus or minus 2 units? Essentially here, think of a phone number. Let's say, for instance, your phone number is 210-245-3222, right? Essentially here, what George Miller would propose is the following. If you've never seen that stimulus before, so if you've never seen that phone number before, and you now have that phone number, or somebody shows you that phone number, you're probably not going to learn it as 210, 454, etc., etc., etc. But rather, you're probably going to learn it as individual units. You're going to say to yourself 210, 454, etc., etc., etc. So what do we do in this particular case? Well, we need to formulate some type of strategy where we're not going to be able to use as much information as we potentially we might have from the stimulus. So in other words, the stimulus is giving us too much information. We need to reduce the amount of information that's being given to us, but yet still have everything accordingly. So in other words, let's say for instance that you know that 210 is the area code for San Antonio. So if 210 is the area code for San Antonio, you may not even ask for the area code. So you know that the person lives in San Antonio, and you say, what's your phone number? And they just say their phone number, but without the 210, because they assume that you also know that they live in San Antonio, so it's not necessary for you to give them that. Because once it is that you give them that information of 210, if they are not necessarily waiting for 210, they may have to work on 210 for a little bit, and they may say, 210, what's that? Oh, they mean San Antonio area code. Okay, perfect, we're going to keep going. So here you may even ignore 210, and you may only work on the numbers that they're giving you. But for instance, there's certain situations where we have phone numbers that are very, very easy for us to actually use. I still remember from when I was a child, my phone number in Mexico was 130301. Now here I implemented George Miller's strategy. Rather than me saying individual units as I am producing, so rather than me saying 130301, which was the phone number I had when I was a child in Mexico, rather I chunk it as 130301. So here I chunk it as 3 particular units. So according to George Miller, if you implement this chunking strategy, it's going to be much more efficient for me to be able to hold information in. So rather than me having 6 digits here that I have to memorize, 130301, I now only have 3 units that I have to memorize, 130301. Another example of this, let's go with the following. So this particular number right here. So if we look at this particular number here that I've just provided for you, you probably don't read this as 90210, but rather you read this as 90210. So if you've ever watched the show 90210, this becomes one single unit rather than 9-0-2-1-0. So rather than having 5 individual units, all that you've done is you've created one larger unit that's 90210. So here you say that very quickly because you've implemented this kind of chunking strategy that you've taken all those numbers and put them together so that way they make coherent sense for you. Now, according to George Miller, to be able to implement a strategy such as this, as chunking, you have to have prior knowledge. Now, if any of you have never seen the show 90210, or you're saying to yourself, hey, that's a very old show, well, how old are you? Well, in this particular instance, if you've never seen this show, using the strategy of 90210 may not necessarily work. So you may have to use 90210 because they exist as individual units for you. But for those of us who have ever seen that show of 90210, this becomes one single unit. So when we look at this idea of having these particular strings of units available to us, we want to make sure that we do not exceed this capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 as to what George Miller proposed for us. Now, we can use other types of strategies like implementing mnemonics. You may also want to implement acronyms if you want to implement those, if you have those available. So for instance, FBI, you may want to use the term FBI rather than saying Federal Bureau of Investigation, or in our particular case, for instance, that we may use something like OLLU. In this particular case, you have OLU, right? That we say OLU rather than OLLU. Now, some of us still say OLLU, but a lot of us say OLU. So why is it that we use this acronym? Well, because we understand it and it saves us time rather than saying Our Lady of the Lake University or OLLU. Because if we say Our Lady of the Lake University, it's a lot more information in comparison to OLU. And when you talk to individuals, you talk about the FBI, but you don't talk about the Federal Bureau of Investigation, even though that's technically their name. So here you're implementing acronyms in those types of situations to try to chunk in those particular situations. So according to George Miller, we can only really hold 7 plus or minus 2. But now, for instance, we go back to this example of 90210, George Miller would have proposed the following. We have 5 individual units here. So you're reaching your limit here of 7 plus or minus 2. Because some individuals have a limit of 5, some individuals have a limit of 7, some individuals may have a limit of 8 or 9, but we don't want to exceed that capacity of 7 plus or minus 2. So rather, we implement a chunking strategy just as we've done here with 90210, and now what have we done? We've used up 1 unit. So we still have somewhere between 6 to 8 6 to 8 units available for me to be able to still include other information. So if you're talking about TV shows and you're like, oh yeah, 90210, and a TV show such as we'll say The Big Bang Theory. So you say BBT in that particular case. So here you're talking about these different shows, but rather than saying 90210 and Big Bang Theory, you just say 90210, BBT, and if the person understands that information, for them, they're able to hold that information a lot better because they're not using up all these attentional resources in terms of short-term memory that George Miller proposed for us. Now just let me very quickly here delete this information here just so that way we have a clean sheet here that we're looking at. Now, when we look at this idea of 7 plus or minus 2, this is the aspect of 7 plus or minus 2 is really true for nonsense syllables, unrelated pictures, words. It doesn't really matter what we find or what we use, but yet the idea of 7 plus or minus 2 seems to be consistent across all these different types of stimuli that we're using. So when you're conversing with individuals and somebody says their phone number to you, you want to keep it within the 7 plus or minus 2 range. So for instance, if you think of a phone number and a phone number complete with area code, so we'll say 210, we'll say 454, and I'm just making these numbers up, 2120, so if this is your phone number, I do apologize. So here, if you look at these numbers, we actually end up having quite a bit of numbers. So you end up having exactly 10 digits. Now, back in the day, and for some of you this may be a very, very old example, and you may say, I would have never done that. Back in the day when we had phone books, we had to go to the phone book, look at the number for the pizza place, and then run to the phone because the phone was not a wireless phone like we have nowadays, but yet it was one of those rotary phones that you had in a specific location like in the kitchen or in the living room, and you had to run to the living room or to the kitchen and dial the number. So here, we were trying to work on keeping 210-454-2120 in our memory store. But since we didn't know this number, what you were trying to do though is you're trying to have individual units. You're trying to have 10 individual units. So you would say to yourself 210-454-2120. So here, by the time you actually got to your rotary phone or to your digital phone that you had but in one specific location, you probably remember 210-45, and you were like, what was the rest? Well, the problem is that we're reaching this limit here of 7 plus or minus 2. You're already at 5 digits. So here, if you'll notice, these numbers have 10, or phone numbers with their area code have 10 values. Without the area code, we have 7 values. So it's much more likely that we're able to remember the 7 values here, the 7 units that we have with the phone number, rather than with the area code in this particular case. So if you already knew the area code, it was no problem because you didn't have to think about it. You just automatically did 210, and then you just try to remember the rest of the information. Or you may have not even needed to dial the 210. Now, in other situations, you're going to find that people may want to give you their phone number, and they give it to you in the way that they've chunked it. So for instance, when I told people my phone number in Mexico, I would always say 13, right, 0301. So here I would say 13, and it takes people a minute because they're like, your phone number starts with a 13? I thought it was with a 1. Well, here it does start with the 1. It's just 1, 3. So I chunked it as 13. So for them, if they weren't waiting for that 1, 3, or if they weren't waiting for that 13 in this particular case, and they were waiting for something that started with a 1, they sometimes got thrown off a little bit in terms of the way that you actually produce some of those numbers. So here, you always have to watch out with how it is that you're transmitting information to specific individuals. So let me erase that information one more time. There we go. So to measure short-term capacity, how do we actually do this? Number one, what we can do is we can present a sequence of numbers or letters or words aloud to a person at the rate of about 1 item per second, and then we ask them to repeat the sequence verbally. So they can either do this in order, or they can present it in backwards order, whatever it is that they want. So here you normally want it to be in order or in backwards order, but as long as they have some type of order associated with the information. Now, what do we find here? If we look here at this specific column that we have here with age, this is the age of individuals that when they're tested at 2 years of age, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 18. You'll notice that as we get older, our memory span for digits, individual units, starts approaching that of 7 plus or minus 2. Children, very, very young children, their memory span is not very good. They can hold about 2 units, about 2 digits if you're giving it to them, but 2 units more specifically. And as they grow older and they have more experience with memory, they are able to more accurately begin to hold more information in terms of short-term memory. But yet, at around the age of 18, when you're a prime teenager, and we would expect here that you have prime cognitive abilities in terms of attention, in terms of spatial awareness, etc., judgments and decision making, we won't say that at 18 that you have great abilities there, but yet we see that individuals around the age of 18 have great ability to hold lots of information, about 7 plus or minus 2 units in this particular case. So if we look at the research behind the capacity of short-term memory, one of the key figures that we find here that really was a pioneer in terms of trying to help us understand what the capacity of short-term memory was and also how that relates to processing of information was Hermann von Ebbinghaus. Ultimately, what Hermann von Ebbinghaus wanted to look at, and just to reiterate what it is that we've already talked about in some of our previous lectures with the work by Ebbinghaus, Ebbinghaus really wanted to identify the basic memory processes that were completely independent associated with knowledge. Now, one of the major critiques that Ebbinghaus had associated with the recollection of information was the following. He believed that if we had any type of emotional attachment or we had any type of semantic meaning associated with words, it was much easier for us to recall those words. But Ebbinghaus predicted, well, what happens in the case where we have items or information that are nonsensical in their nature? So in other words, rather than having a word such as love that holds some type of abstract meaning to you, and it also has some type of emotional attachment, what if we present you with a random string of letters that we're going to here call a syllable, but they're going to be nonsense syllables, so they have no meaning at all, they have no emotional attachment that they can create. So if we present this information to an individual, how will their recollection look like at 0 days, at 5 days, at 10 days, at 15 days, and how difficult is that individual going to be working on processing that information? Now, ultimately here, in terms of difficulty associated with processing of information, we really want to explore the question, how long does it take me to actually learn this information if I have no meaning and no emotion associated with these items? So Ebbinghaus created nonsense syllables such as the following as CUD, right? So cud, bach, and he had lots of other terms that he attempted to learn himself. So here, Ebbinghaus very creatively used himself as his only participant. So he actually ran through all these words and tried to learn them as best as he possibly could. So what Ebbinghaus wanted to look at was the following. How long does it actually take me to recite a list of words? Now, very incredibly, Ebbinghaus did come to some very important results on what he called Ebbinghaus's learning curve. But now, associated with this idea of Ebbinghaus's learning curve, we also look at potential results associated with how it is that we forget information. So in just a second here, I'm going to show you his results from how long it actually takes to learn information perfectly. But I also want to show you the effects of trying to recall this information at later periods of time. Because it does me no good just to learn information right away and then try to process it and use it at that exact moment in time, because it may not be necessary for me to use it within the next 5 seconds or the next 10 minutes, but rather I may need to access this information sometime down the line, maybe in 10, 15, even 20 days from now. So incredibly, what Ebbinghaus found was the following result, what he called Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. Now, in terms of the forgetting term here, I would again put that in quotes for you because, again, you know how I feel about the term forgetting, because it would imply that we completely lost that information. But here, ultimately, what Ebbinghaus wanted to look at was what is the rate of decrease of being able to accurately retrieve information once it's been in long-term memory. So according to Ebbinghaus, once it is that we put these nonsense syllable words into long-term memory, this is ultimately the product that we're going to see in terms of our recall percentages as days go by. So you'll notice here at 0 days, Ebbinghaus himself was able to recall 100% of those words, right? Or those nonsense syllables, I should say. I shouldn't say words. So these nonsense syllables. But now as days continue to go by, at 1 day, now we're all of a sudden at 45%. 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, now so we're at about 22% or 21%. And you'll notice that we continue to have these slight decreases after at about 4 days or so. So after about 4 days, Ebbinghaus found this very important curve and essentially this plateauing effect. This plateauing effect signifies something very important for us in terms of our memory research. And ultimately what this indicates for us is that there comes a point where the information that you're able to retrieve after a given period of time is pretty much going to be the information that you're always going to retrieve. So it's not like if anything new is all of a sudden going to pop out, that all of a sudden we're going to have this huge spike and on day 10 and say, oh, now all of a sudden I remember 100% of the information that was provided to me during that test, or during which I studied, but rather we're going to continue to see this gradual decline and then this plateauing effect that we're going to stop seeing these significant decreases occur. So even though we may go from 21 to 20% across 15 or 20 days, still that decrease is probably not going to be a significant decrease in those particular cases. So a very important result that Ebbinghaus found for us in terms of the long-term effects associated with learning of information. Now, in terms of trying to understand this idea of how many run-throughs are actually needed to recite information perfectly, Ebbinghaus ultimately found what he called the word length effect. And essentially, the word length effect was the following. He found that if the number of syllables increased from 1 syllable to 2 syllables to 3 syllables to 4 to 5, the proportion correct in terms of his recollection started to decrease. So he saw this negative relationship between the number of syllables that he was trying to memorize in terms of his nonsense syllables. So as the number of nonsense syllables increased, it was harder for him to accurately recall all of them. So here, very important for us that this is a very difficult process, that it's as information is getting added, especially in terms of the number of syllables that are getting added together. So here he would combine syllables together. As he combined syllables together to form new nonsense items, it was a lot more difficult for him to accurately recall that information. Now, on the right-hand side here, you're going to see Ebbinghaus's learning curve. And essentially what he demonstrated here was that, look, whenever it is I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 syllables that I'm trying to recall, I only need to look at them about 1 time and I'm able to recall them accurately. But once I get to 7, 8, 9, and 10, I need to start looking at them more and more so that way I can accurately recall all the ones previous to it. Because again, what he wants to get to is he wants to get to that 100% mark in terms of how many times I have to recite this information to recall it perfectly. So here, this also demonstrates to us this idea that George Miller proposed for us, of 7 plus or minus 2. Because you'll notice that exactly at the 7 value mark, in terms of the number of syllables, it starts getting really difficult for Ebbinghaus to start learning this information with 1 run through. He probably starts needing 2 runs. Now all of a sudden with 8 syllables, he needs 8 times viewing this information. At 9 syllables, he needs 12 views. And at 10 syllables, he needs 16 views to be able to recall all of the items prior to that. So again, demonstrating to us that there starts becoming this overload of information that we're tossing at individuals. So here, even though he's remembered this information 100% accurately right after he learns the information, he's still having to spend a lot longer in terms of trying to read and understand this information than being able to process it immediately, such as he saw between 1 to 6 words in this particular case. Now, when looking at short-term memory a little bit more closely, we have to also consider that there are going to be many other issues that we want to take into consideration, especially how it is that we want to recall information. If we want to recall information perfectly, the way that it was presented to us, we're going to see differing effects versus just remembering information. So if we try to remember information in order, it all of a sudden starts becoming a little bit more of a taxing cognitive task. So in other words, it starts becoming more difficult than in comparison to just reciting the information and just saying it doesn't even matter in what order it came in, I just remember the information. So here, if we look at what we call order codes versus item codes, we find that there are better effects or better results or stronger results for item codes. In other words, I'm able to remember the information. It doesn't matter what order it's in, but I at least remember the information. The difficult part then comes about whenever it is that I'm trying to remember the specific order at which information was presented to me in. Now, we also find that we encounter what are called phonemic code errors. And ultimately, with phonemic code errors, we find that errors that sound alike are actually going to be processed as memorized units. So in other words, bat and cat are probably going to have a lot of similarity in terms of the way that we actually produce them, right? In terms of our sound. The major difference here is the ba and the ka sound that we have at the beginning of each one of them. Now, what we find here is that there's a lot of similarity between these two items in terms of their sounds. One of the things that we'll find is that there's going to be lots of errors that actually occur in terms of the recollection. This happens to us all the time. Whenever it is that we say the wrong word, but it sounds a lot like the word that we were trying to say. And you even catch yourself and you're like, yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to say this, and you're like, it sounds just like it, but I said this other word. Sorry about that. And the reason that that happens is because there's a lot of similarity between those sounds. So when you memorize the information, there's these associations that are being made. And since we're making these associations, there's going to be some shared information across similarities or similar units. So in this particular case, bat and cat have very similar sounds in terms of the at part, right? So the bat or the cat sounds that we have here towards the end of those words, but yet the key difference is at the beginning. So even though we ask an individual to learn bat, there is a possibility that cat may be recalled because for them, they share that similarity and it's much more likely that an error will occur in that instance. But if you present somebody with bat and then they recall tiger, that's a little weird one because they shouldn't recall tiger because the sounds are so vastly different. They shouldn't say, oh, sorry, bat and tiger sound very, very similar to each other. That's why I produced tiger rather than bat. When in reality, they share no phonemic similarity in those particular instances. What about in the case where we have different durations and how that may potentially affect short-term memory? One of the interesting results here that we find is the following result. Using what's called the Brown-Peterson task, where we give different intervals of recall selection in terms of seconds, one of the incredible findings that we find is the following. If we ask individuals to recall information as soon as they learn information, we see that they remember information at about 100%. So just as what Ebbinghaus taught us, right? That at 100%, right after you learn the information, you're at 100%. But what happens if you learn information and then we ask you to wait 3 seconds? We see a very rapid decline in terms of your recall proportion correct. So in other words, you go from 100% immediately after learning information to somewhere about 50% at 3 seconds. At 6 seconds, you're about 40%. At 9 seconds, you're about 20%. At 12 seconds, you're at about 18%. About 15 seconds, you're going to be about 15 or 16% in those particular cases. So what does this mean for us? It means that if you want to recall information as best as you possibly can, as soon as it's being presented to you, recall that information right afterwards because it's going to be such a high likelihood that you're probably going to be at 100%. But as you start waiting longer and longer and longer, we're going to start seeing these decreases that are going to be occurring in terms of your ability to correctly recall information. So in other words, retrieving the information because more than likely the information didn't even get into long-term memory. So things are starting to decay away in that particular instance. Now, when we think about this idea of presenting information, right? So going back here to our graph and we say, all right, we've presented information to individuals and what we now want is for that information to be in the long-term store. So in other words, I'm working on a Word document on my computer. It's done auto-save a couple of times, but now I really want it to be saved on the hard drive forever. So in other words, how do I get information from my short-term to my long-term memory store? This is where the idea of working memory really comes in. Because if you've noticed in our discussion of short-term memory up to this point, we really haven't talked about any mechanism that's really allowing me to process and work on information. Rather, all that we've talked about is you have information, we ask you to recall it, and then we'll see what happens. All right, but what about processing this information? What about working on this information? Is there any way to potentially increase the likelihood that information is going to be in the long-term store rather than just solely falling away and never being correctly recalled, or potentially never even getting pushed over into long-term memory? Because that is one of the possible results that may happen. So in this particular case, why is information being recalled less as the number of seconds go by? There could be a couple of explanations. Number one, information isn't getting processed accordingly. So in other words, you're not paying sufficient attention to the information to be able to continue to work on it and provide recollection of it immediately. Or potentially at longer points here, as we have, some of that information is not going into long-term store. So in other words, those files are not getting saved on the hard drive and then you're not retrieving them. Or information is getting stored in the hard drive, but you put it in the wrong folder and you're not able to now find it. So ultimately, how can we work on this information and put it in the right spot, work on it appropriately, and make sure that things are working correctly? Well, ultimately, that's really where working memory comes in. Now, with the idea of working memory, we really have this idea of how do we process information from STM to LTM? So from short-term to long-term memory, how do we actually work on it? Alan Baddeley proposed for us back in the 80s and then made some revisions back in 2000 to ultimately his theory of working memory. In his theory of working memory, what Alan Baddeley proposed was the following. We have to process information and maintain information close to or in our conscious awareness. What does this mean? It essentially means that we have to keep the information at a point of us paying attention, because that's what conscious awareness is, and we have to be continuously working on that information as much as we can to be able to process the information correctly. Now, going back to, for instance, what Aristotle told us about the soft or the hard wax, one of the things that you can consider here is people who have hard wax, you have to push in harder with whatever object it is that you're trying to make the impression in the wax. So in other words, the harder that you press, the more time you're spending working on that memory to try to leave a good impression and a good amount of detail. Same thing is being said here by Alan Baddeley. If you want to have accurate information being processed and you want to be able to put it in the right place or the place that you think it's supposed to go accurately, and you want to try to retrieve it as best as you possibly can, then you have to work consciously to be able to monitor and make sure that you're getting all the details and get as much information as you possibly can. So in other words, you pay attention and you're going to be rehearsing. So in other words, we continuously work on that information. Now, ultimately, according to Baddeley, this is not specifically limited to just processing of external information. So in other words, it's not all about just processing what I'm currently saying right now, but rather you can potentially think of things that are already in your memory store, you can bring them back to your conscious awareness and continue to work on them. So in other words, think of a situation where you've ever had to think of a memory and then you continuously are thinking of that information and you continue to work on it. If you've ever gone through a breakup or there's something suspicious going on that somebody may have said to you or done to you, first it goes into long-term memory and then later on you may think about it and it comes back to conscious awareness and you continue to think and mull over it and think of all the little details. Ultimately, that's what Baddeley was saying. That I don't need that physical stimulus to even be present anymore. If it's in my memory and I can bring it back from long-term memory, I can open up that document and look at it on my computer, I can continue to work on it at that point. So I can continue to think about that information and think about all the nitty-gritty aspects associated with what I know of that information. Now, according to Baddeley, just as we saw here associated with the idea of 7 plus or minus 2, Baddeley also proposed that we have about 7 units maximum in terms of capacity that we can work on with working memory. Now here, assume that working memory is a component of short-term memory, because that's really what it is. It's not in long-term memory, but rather it's the bridge that's going to connect the two. So in other words, it's helping short-term memory information get to the long-term memory store. Okay, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to cross that bridge, and we're using working memory as that bridge. So ultimately, according to Baddeley, whenever it is that we're trying to dual task, one of the things that you're doing here is that you're using up your attention resources. So in other words, if you have competing resources, right? So in other words, if you have the same resource that's being tapped in by multiple stimuli, it's going to be very hard for you to adequately process both. So for instance, listening to music and reading a story passage, or if you want to, take another example, listening to music and studying, a lot of people think, I study a lot better whenever I listen to music. Technically, no, because the problem that's happening is that when you read, what are you doing? You're converting whatever it is that you're reading into auditory information that you're processing in your brain. Even though you're not saying it out loud, you're still processing and using the auditory rehearsal loop here that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Music is doing the same thing. It's taking information that's auditory in nature and processing that information there. So in other words, they're competing for the same resource of auditory resources. So thus, it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to process both adequately. So one is going to have to suffer over the other. So maybe when you're taking your exam, you may not know the answers to the questions, but hey, you may hum along the song that you were listening to while you were studying, right? So here, it's kind of this idea of, well, what do I want? Am I going to pick or choose, or what am I going to do in this specific instance as to what I'm going to use? Should I use the same resource in multiple stimuli, or should I have one stimulus being in one sensory system and another stimulus being in a different sensory system? Potentially, and we're going to look at that in just a bit here. Now, interestingly though, just as with whatever it is that we've been discussing this semester, we continue to talk about individual differences between individuals. And here what we find is that individuals have differences in terms of their working memory capacity. That there are some individuals who have high working memory capacity and other individuals that have low working memory capacity. In other words, some individuals have the ability to continuously be working on many different stimuli at the same time, even when they're competing for the same resource. But yet the likelihood of them being able to be successful may not necessarily be that great, but it's still better than individuals who have low working memory capacity. According to Baddeley, individuals who have low working memory capacity, they may be unable to filter out and process information as adequately as a person with high working memory capacity. So for them, they may have to limit the amount of information that's coming in to be able to process it more adequately. So for them, they may need less distractions. They may need less things that are competing for the same resources as well. And we see that through empirical research that we find some very interesting results associated with high and low working memory capacity between individuals. We find that people who, for instance, are in a low pressure situation, if they have low working memory capacity, the proportion or percentage correct that they will recall will probably be somewhere about 65%, or 75%, somewhere around there. But if they have high working memory capacity, in other words, they're able to attenuate to different information or different pieces of the puzzle that are being shown to the individual, they have a percentage correct of being about 84, 85%. Now, if we look at high pressure, these results then go away. And one of the interesting results that we find here is that under high pressure situations, people who have high working and low working memory capacities seem to perform about the same. Now, why might this happen if you want to think of an explanation? Well, under a low pressure situation, the person who has low working memory, for them, it still may be very difficult to concentrate on different aspects of the world or different pieces of the puzzle that may be out there, different stimuli. Under a high pressure situation, they're already accustomed to only focusing in on one or two pieces, so they may be able to filter out something like personal pressure or anxiety that they may potentially be feeling. But a person who has high working memory capacity may feel that pressure, and thus their performance may potentially decrease in that situation. So that may be one thing that we may want to consider here in terms of individual differences. All right, so now let's look a little bit more closely at working memory. So what is working memory? Working memory ultimately has four components that we need to really focus in on. The four components as shown to you here in this graph are the central executive, the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, and the episodic buffer. Now the episodic buffer is a more of a newer component. This modification of the episodic buffer was actually added back in 2002 by Baddeley. The original 1986 model only was the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad. But now including the episodic buffer is a very good addition to the theory, and we'll talk a little bit about what its purpose is in just a bit. So in terms of the four components of working memory model, the very first one, and I think the most important one that we have to talk about, is what we call here the central executive. I also like to call the central executive the big boss, and the reason I like to call it the big boss is because this is the one who distributes attentional resources to the specific task of interest. So ultimately, what the central executive is doing is it controls what we call the slave systems here in this particular case. So ultimately, the working memory idea associated with the central executive is that it's going to be the one who's going to be delegating to the other systems what it is that they have to do in terms of paying attention. So who gets what percentage of attentional resources? So is the phonological loop going to receive a certain percentage, the visual spatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer? How is that attention resource going to be distributed across these three systems in this particular case? Now we also have what's called the visual spatial sketchpad, and the visual spatial sketchpad essentially keeps information in short-term visual storage for just very short periods of time. So if you remember from our discussion a couple of minutes ago that we talked about this whole idea of iconic representations, that we have this representation of visual information for very short periods of time after it's being presented, essentially that's a component associated with the visual spatial sketchpad. So whenever it is that we have information and then we take the information away from you, that sensory register that's keeping that information in your attentional field, for instance, for just a very brief period of time after it's been taken away, is essentially going to be your visual spatial sketchpad. Or you can close your eyes and imagine what it is that you just saw, and that image that you can see with your eyes closed is going to be your visual spatial sketchpad at work. Now, what's the purpose of the visual spatial sketchpad? Well, if we keep information here for a very short period of time, visually represented in this iconic representation, the purpose is that even though you're not going to have the full set of details associated with that visual stimulus, at least you can keep a very small portion of that visual stimulus present while you're continuing to work on it and try to decipher some of the information associated with it. Now, our third component is what we call the phonological loop. The phonological loop here, in terms of this echoic representation that we've talked about, is essentially rehearsal of auditory or visual information. So you can convert visual information into auditory information by saying that is a green house that has a brown rooftop, or whatever the case may be. So ultimately, the purpose of the phonological loop is to continuously be rehearsing this auditory information that you've created. So we want to continuously be working on this information and saying to ourselves, I'm going to repeat it, I'm going to repeat it, I'm going to repeat it, so that way I can memorize it accordingly. Because the idea of continuous rehearsal and the continuous processing of visual information, in this particular case with the visual spatial sketchpad, in both cases with both of these systems, the purpose is to learn information, to transfer information from short-term memory into long-term memory in this particular case. Now, the phonological loop also includes what's called the articulatory loop, and the articulatory loop is essentially that inner voice that you have that you can continue to work on information even after the auditory stimulus is no longer present. So the purpose of both the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop is essentially to keep information available for you so you can continue to work on that information. All right, that's really the idea. So even though that information may potentially be gone or it continues to change, at least here you're continuously processing some of that information. Now, the last component, the episodic buffer, which is the new addition to the theory, is a very critical and crucial part of the puzzle, because the idea behind the episodic buffer is the following. It's ultimately going to integrate information that's being received by the central executive, who's ultimately delegating what attentional resources are going to the slave systems. It's also going to be integrating information from the visual spatial sketchpad and also from the phonological loop. So imagine it as being the major processor that's then going to be sending information over into long-term memory, and it's going to hold information in there for very short periods of time. It's going to buffer it, essentially. So like on your computer system, whenever you're loading a program and saying buffering, what does that mean? It's getting it ready. So it's integrating all the parts so that way it can enter the system into long-term storage, or it's bringing information back from long-term storage also and allowing it to then come out to conscious awareness. So the episodic buffer also buffers information that's already stored and brings it back out, and it makes it again available into the phonological loop and also to the visual spatial sketchpad and to the central executive to again delegate those resources. Because again, here the point of learning information is not just to learn it and keep it stored away. So you don't save a file onto your flash drive just to store it and never use it again, but rather you store information into long-term memory or into your flash drive, and then you retrieve that information later on. But how do you retrieve it? There has to be that mechanism that allows you to buffer the information from long-term, bring it back out into conscious awareness, into working memory, or into short-term memory, and continuously be processing that information again, work on it again, and then be able to store it again. Because one of the things that may potentially happen is that when you retrieve that file from your flash drive and you open up the document, you may say, oh, there's some modifications that I need to make to this document. The same things happen to memories. You may have to make some modifications to the information that you had stored in terms of your memory bank, in terms of long-term memory. So once you bring that information out, you may have to modify that recipe a little bit, or modify the image of what you've created, or modify that file on your flash drive, and then save it again. So that's really the idea behind working memory in these particular cases. Now, we also do find that there are some major differences between individuals associated with working memory. Now, aside from just looking at this idea of high and low working memory capacity, we also see that there are some particular issues associated with working memory capacity and age. One of the things that we find is that as you grow older, working memory capacity decreases. So in other words, as you get older, there is a negative relationship with working memory. So in other words, it's harder for you to maintain and distribute attentional resources to the phonological loop, to the episodic buffer, to the visual spatial sketchpad, and process information accurately. The younger you are, the better. And again, we've seen how memory works a little bit with aging, that we're not saying that when you're a newborn, you're going to be remembering everything that exists out there. But as you get to your prime age of about 18 years old, that's when really memory capacity is going to be essentially peaking around those age ranges around there. So here, what do we find with the elderly? Well, we notice that for them, it's a lot harder for them to learn new information, because for them, it's harder to also pay attention. Because then again, you also have to think that our brain is an organ. And as we get older, our organs start sometimes not working properly. So in our particular cases, even our brain may potentially not be working to the best of its availability, to the best of its ability. So in this particular case, we do see that negative relationship existing. Now, we also do see the relationship that we've already previously discussed with the idea of anxiety or with pressure affecting working memory. So even individuals who have this difference of terms of high working versus low working memory, we still find that once it is that we include pressure into the mix, so in other words, we provide pressure, we provide you with an anxiety-induced situation, it really takes away that factor of high versus low working memory capacity for individuals, and it essentially puts everybody on the same playing field. All right, so let's here look at this whole big model that we've been talking about. We began with the environmental stimulus, right, that we have out there in our world that enters our sensory store. We process that information and we pay attention, and now we start working on it at the short-term memory store where we're going to have working memory existing. So remember, working memory also exists here at the short-term memory store. And now we send in information into the long-term store. Now, what is it that we ideally want to do? We want to take information out and put it back into short-term memory. Now, aside from just putting it back in short-term memory, so one of the things that we want to try to do is we want to try to work on information, which is this specific loop here that I've created for you. So this loop is the idea that before I put it into long-term memory, I'm continuously working on this information. So this loop here represents working memory, that we're continuously processing that information again, making sure that we're paying attention and getting the right information in. Because once we put information into long-term memory, whenever it is that we take it out, we're going to assume that it's accurate. So here, why would you ever assume that whatever you saved into your flash drive was the wrong file or the wrong document? You wouldn't, would you? You would say, well, I saved it on my flash drive. I assume that that has to be the right file. Well, here there is a possibility that whatever you store into your memory bank in terms of your brain may potentially be the wrong thing. And here we want to avoid retrieving the wrong thing or having put the wrong information in and retrieving that wrong information that you say, well, this is the way I learned it. Now all of a sudden I'm pulling that information out. So for instance, think of this, okay? We're going to say this border here that we have in terms of where it says short-term memory. If I were to ask you what color this border is, your answer would probably be yellow, right? And you wouldn't be wrong. And the reason you're not wrong is because your entire life we've told you that this color here is yellow. So in other words, that specific wavelength that's being created there has an absorption and also a reflection rate and ultimately produces the psychological property of what we call yellow. But why do we call it yellow? So why did we say that word? Why didn't we call it sunshine light sky? I don't know, right? We could have potentially called it that, and you still would have been right if that's what you would have learned. The point is the following. We live in a physical world versus a psychological world. In the physical world, we have physical properties that exist, just like my voice. But the psychological world is the interpretation of what the sounds that I'm producing mean. And that's a very important issue here that we have to consider. That the sounds, for instance, that I'm producing are completely meaningless. But yet you've given them meaning because we've learned that these specific sounds, when they occur together, form some type of meaning. Such as in the case with my color. Color is a psychological property that we give to the specific color. In this particular case that we say it is yellow, thus that is the category name. That's a psychological property. But what's the physical property associated with the nanometer reading of the color yellow? And in our particular case, it would be something somewhere between 400 to 700 nanometers because that's what we can see or we can detect in terms of our visual wavelength range that we can actually detect. But here, you learned that this was yellow. Potentially, we could have told you from birth that this was sunshine light sky. And your entire life, whenever you saw this particular color here, you would have said sunshine light sky. And we would have continuously been telling you, yes, you're right, you're right, you're right. But then you encounter somebody who says, this is sunshine light sky. Nah, man, it's yellow. And you're going to say to yourself, well, why is it yellow? It's supposed to be sunshine light sky because that's what I was taught. Or that's what the color is. And somebody else tells you, no, it's a completely different color. Like that doesn't even exist. Yellow is the color that it's supposed to be in this particular case. So here, you are responsible for what got put into long-term memory. You're responsible for what goes on your flash drive or your hard drive for your computer. What you pull out from it is going to be what you saved on it. So sometimes we say the following, garbage in, garbage out. So in other words, sometimes we put garbage in to a flash drive, sometimes what we get back is going to be garbage as well because it's not the right information. The same thing can happen to us in terms of our memories that we're creating. Sometimes what we create is the wrong memory. We create the wrong information. You pull it out and you don't know any better. You think it's the right information. You use it and something bad may potentially happen in that particular case. So when we look at this aspect of putting information into long-term memory, that's going to depend on this aspect of what we call encoding. So how we put information in is going to depend on how we encode information. And then when we retrieve, it's going to depend also on this aspect of how we encode it. So when I encode information, it's going to make or affect the way that I retrieve the information as well. And here we're going to work through an example in just a minute here. So when we look at this idea of short-term memory and long-term memory, and we're trying to understand this whole connection between recall ability and making sure that we retrieve the correct information, think of a situation where we would want to look at how a child learns. Children are really good examples of how it is that they learn information at one point and then they have to make modifications and then restructure information that they've already learned throughout their lives. So one of the interesting things that we find with children is that we very frequently encounter what are called over-categorizations. And over-categorizations with children is a linguistic phenomenon in where children essentially place items into one specific category because they don't know any other category names. So if you've ever gone to the zoo, and you can always try this at your local zoo, if you go to the zoo and you go around a child who's maybe about 2.5, 3 years of age or so, they tend to do this quite frequently, especially if it's the very first time that they've ever gone to a zoo. And now, one of the incredible things that you'll find is that with children, one of the things that they have probably encountered throughout their lives is they probably have encountered a cat at some point in time. Let that be a stray cat or a cat that a neighbor may have or that you may yourself may have. So children first look at a cat and they learn that that is the name of that specific stimulus, right, of that category, which is a cat. Now, that's what they've grown accustomed to. So if we look at prototype theory, right, so what we talked about last week, with prototype theory, they're going to assume that they have this prototype of what kind of fits into those parameters associated with that object. It's got 4 legs, it's got fur, it's got whiskers, it's got ears, it's got kind of like this little weird kind of feline face. And I know I just said that cats are weird. I unfortunately am not a cat lover, as you can tell. So that's kind of the idea that they've grasped, right? So they have this kind of idea and they say, okay, well, that object is different than, for instance, a dog. So they'll look at that and they may potentially confuse the dog the very first time that they see a dog if they've only experienced cats before, because there's some similarities. Again, they may have whiskers, they have 4 legs, they have fur, they have ears, they have a tail. And there may be some confusion there, but potentially they may not, right? But there are still quite a lot of similarities between them because, again, remember, the idea that they have of their cat is an exemplar in this particular case. Now, whenever it is that they go to the zoo, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to try to match up information that they're seeing in the current world. So in other words, their animals that they are looking at with their previous experiences. So again, the stimulus exists, they create electricity, it goes through to their brain, and they retrieve information based on their previous experiences and have an action. And in this particular case, their action is to say the category name associated with that animal. And in this particular case, if they see a lion or a tiger, they normally tend to over-categorize the name. So what they'll say is, they'll say kitty cat. And especially if they call it a kitty cat, right? So they'll say it's a kitty cat. And here, as a good parent or as a good, caregiver, they should say, no, that's funny, but no, unfortunately, it's not a kitty cat. It's a type of cat if you want, right? But it's not a kitty cat like the one that we have at home. It's not like Spot, for instance. So here, what is it? It's a tiger or it's a lion. And why is that important? Because if we don't correct that specific category name at that point in time, and the child is then reinforced, right? So we look at behaviorism ideas associated with learning. If we then reinforce that behavior by laughing and going, yes, it is a kitty cat, the child then assumes I'm correct, so I'm going to keep using that same category name. So whenever it is that they try to recall information, it's going to depend heavily on how it is that they encoded the information at the initial points when they retrieved it and they worked on it again, right? So again, we go back and we take that information out from long-term memory and we put it back into short-term memory and we continue to work on that information again. So now the child then pays attention to you laughing or you saying, yes, it's a kitty cat. So for them, they say, hey, that's a correct assumption associated with that name. I'm going to go ahead and file that back into the kitty cat box. So now a tiger or a lion and the cat that I have at home are exactly in the same category. Now, what you don't want is you don't want that child to grow up and then one day go on safari, right, to Africa or any other place in the world where they have tigers or lions. And they're out on safari, and now all of a sudden they get out of the car because they say, oh, look at that, it's a kitty cat. And they want to go and pet the kitty cat. And as you would assume, that's a terrible thing that they would do because they should never go to a lion or a tiger that's out in the wild and try to go and pet it, or even the ones in the zoo, right? Why? Because they're potentially very hazardous animals. Hey, even regular cats are very hazardous, to be honest with you. That's one of the reasons I don't like them, because they scratch a lot. So ultimately here, out in the real world, that may have a very, very deadly effect, that they go out on safari and all of a sudden they see an animal and they say, it's a kitty cat, and they run towards that lion or that tiger, potentially then putting their survival at risk. So here, what should the child do is when they first encounter a lion or a tiger, let that be at the zoo or in a book that you're presenting to them or whatever the case may be, and they say kitty cat, or they say, I don't know what that is, here you should correct that behavior and you should say, well, that is a lion, that is a tiger, and this is the sound a tiger makes, so this is the sound a lion makes versus what our cat makes. They're similar, but they are different. These are big and they run very fast or whatever the case may be. So that way, the child now learns new information associated with that new object. So even though there are similarities between their cat and a lion or a tiger, there are still inherent differences between them. So here now all of a sudden they create a new category name for a lion and for a tiger and also for a regular domestic cat. So the recall is going to depend heavily on how it is that they encoded that information, and then when they retrieve that information, it's going to depend heavily on that aspect of encoding. Because if they encoded it incorrectly, and then they take that information out, ultimately we may potentially have some disastrous effects that may occur later on. All right, so now the key is we got information into long-term memory, right? We saved it on our flash drive, we saved it on our hard drive, right? Or in here, our metaphorical hard drive or flash drive, if you want to think of it like that. So ultimately, when we think of long-term memory, one of the biggest questions that we always encounter is how long is long-term memory? And the answer really is, well, it may be forever. So why don't I say it will last forever or it does not last forever? Because we really don't know the answer to that, to be honest for you. One of the things that we encounter here is that people actually have lots of information throughout their lifespans. So in other words, they recall information from very early on in their lives, and they're able to maintain it throughout their entire lifespans, even into their old age. I still remember my grandmother, for instance, when she was very sick. She was 86 years old when she passed away, and I still remember the week before she passed away, she would still remember information about the objects that she sold in her store. So she had a store in Mexico where she sold little souvenirs. She had a souvenir shop, and she still remembered all the prices, and she would tell you the little spiels associated with how it was that you were supposed to sell that. And it had been years since she had gone to her souvenir store anymore. We had closed it down after she had gotten sick. So here, it was impressive that even somebody that was so much older would still be able to recall such pertinent information for them in their particular life. And they would still remember all the names of their grandchildren, all the names of their children, all the names of all these different things, even their elementary school teachers and so on and so forth. How is it that we possibly remember that information? Is it really going to be useful to know what your cat's name was whenever it is that you're 85? Well, maybe, right? Who knows? That's why we put that information into that memory bank, because potentially we may need that information later on in our lives. So again, in terms of length, how long is it going to be there for? We really don't know. We really don't know what the expiration or in terms of the size difference is also going to be in terms of long-term memory. Now, when we look at long-term memory is divided into 3 subcategories. Now, next week we're going to talk a lot more about long-term memory and about these subcategories, but just to look at these specific categories just generally here, these are the 3. Number 1 is episodic memory, number 2 is semantic memory, and 3 is what we call procedural memory. Now, the first 2, episodic and semantic memory, fall under the domain of what we call declarative memory. Now, ultimately here, why do we call it declarative memory? Because we're essentially declaring information is what it is that we actually use that term for, right? Again, very creative day in the naming process in the field of psychology here. But ultimately, with episodic memory and with semantic memory, they're very similar to each other in the sense that with episodic memory, we really have information associated with our own lives. So we have these ideas that potentially our memories function like if they were episodes within our own life. So ultimately, these are conscious experiences that we're recollecting, right? So things that we experience in our world that we say, hey, you know what? I remember having done this action. Or I remember talking to this person. Or I remember this event or this emotion. So you remember specifically details associated with that specific conscious experience. Now, with semantic memory, ultimately here what we have is just the general organization of knowledge about how the world works. So information about words, about other facts that we may know, things about history and things of that nature that you don't specifically know where you learned the information, but you just know the information. So here that's very, very important to understand that with semantic memory, we don't really know specifics about where we learned it. That refers back to episodic memory, but we just know the information. So you know what the word blue represents, but you don't know where you learned the word blue. So you don't remember specifically that moment where you learned about blue, but you may remember specifically where you were when you got engaged or when you got dumped or whatever the case may be, because that functions like an episode, but your knowledge of the word blue is just knowledge that you have. It's semantic memory. You don't have specific information about where you learned it. Now, the third subcategory is what we call procedural memory, or what we also call implicit memory, that you really don't have explanations for how to do things. You just know how to do them. So here we actually do procedural aspects, right? So again, very creative day in the naming process. Why is it called procedural memory? Because it's the way that we actually do things, the procedures. So here we just know how to do actions, but we don't know specifically how to explain how to do them. So for instance, riding a bicycle, explain it to somebody how to ride a bicycle. Well, you put your hands on the handlebar and then you just go. That's not an explanation, to be honest with you. That is a terrible explanation if you're trying to teach somebody that information. So ultimately here with procedural memory, what you're trying to do is you're trying to explain to an individual specifically all the elements that go involved into the acquisition of that specific task or that specific action. And here with procedural memory, we really don't know how to do that. If you were to actually describe specifics about it, that would be great, but unfortunately most of the time we just say, well, this is how you do that action, this is how you cook if you don't follow recipes, or this is how it is that you ride a bicycle or that you drive a car, and it's very difficult to kind of explain how we actually do that. So ultimately, when we think about long-term memory, we don't really think about this idea of the clock is ticking, because how long is information going to be in there? Well, again, we really don't know. It could potentially be in there forever, or it may be in there for limited amounts of time. But to be honest, again, we don't have the answer to that. So it's very important for us to think in terms of this idea of the clock, that we may have information being there forever, but then why don't we access it? Well, the reason is because sometimes that information doesn't get used for a very long time, and it just gets stored away very, very far into your hard drive. So here, just as with files in your flash drive, that sometimes you may create other subfolders, or you have so many files that there may be files that are much more important that you're constantly using or continuously using from the flash drive, but yet there are some files that you stored that are very, very deep within the flash drive that you don't even access. But if you really sat down and looked through them, you might potentially access them, or you found some route to actually being able to do that. So we attend to information, but how do we actually get information into long-term memory? And then how do we actually get that information out, right? Because once we put information in, it's important for us to also talk about how do we get information out. Well, the issue here is that if we can really work on information for longer than about 45 seconds, we're going to be able to put that information into long-term memory. That's ultimately what we assume here. You work on it for about 45 seconds and you're able to put that into your storage, your permanent storage. So a lot of it is really going to depend on the encoding of the information and how much attention it is that you're paying to that specific stimulus of interest or to that specific information that you're trying to memorize. So here what we're trying to do is we're trying to say to ourselves, I need to really focus on the specific task and learn as many details as I possibly can associated with that stimulus, or try to understand as much information as I possibly can from what's being provided to me. So here, the longer that I spend working on that information, the better it's going to be for me. So in terms of what Aristotle was saying to us, here, the harder you press into that hard wax or even into the soft wax, the better the impression that's going to be left by that specific object. So the details are going to be a lot clearer, and you're going to be able to process a lot more information, and you're going to be able to recall a lot better details associated with that particular stimulus of interest. Now, whenever it is that we process information, there's really two levels of processing that may potentially happen at the encoding stage. We can do what's called shallow processing, and ultimately with shallow processing is probably what many of you are doing right now, that all you're doing is you're reading or you're hearing information as I'm presenting it to you, but you're really not doing anything more than that. You're really not making any deeper processing or making the connections associated with elaboration. So here, rather than just listening to the words that I'm saying or writing down the things that are actually on the slide, one of the things that you should do is maybe pause it, think about what it is that I'm saying, think about what it is that you wrote. We find this lots and lots of times whenever it is that we do this with students in terms of a classroom demonstration. I do this all the time when I do a live presentation, is that I have students write information, they write down whatever's on the slide, and then I'll ask them, a minute or two later, I'll say, hey, what was on the previous slide? And many times students will be like, I don't know. And I'll have a person be like, oh, well, it said we. I'm like, awesome. So you got one word out of 100 words that were on the screen. Anything else? And they're like, we talked about attention or something like that. It's like, so you wrote down information. You literally were looking at what was presented to you. You wrote down information. You had an action, but yet you don't know what you wrote. You don't know what it means. And here, that's the problem that we find later on when trying to study. That lots of times, students end up looking at their notes and saying, what does that even mean? They didn't give themselves enough time to really process what it was that was being said to them. So here, we really do need deeper processing to occur to really understand the ideas behind what it is that we're learning and really try to make those deeper level connections associated with the information that's being presented to us. Now, one interesting theory that we find here is this idea of what we call encoding specificity. Encoding specificity ultimately predicts the following: that we have a higher likelihood of successful retrieval of information from long-term memory back into short-term memory when we increase the similarity between retrieval and encoding contexts or situations. So in other words, we may use a situation or an environment that we're accustomed to help us recall information. So one of the things that we find very frequently here is that whenever it is that we give exams in classrooms where the class took place, students are much more likely to do well there in comparison to giving out the exact same exam over the exact same material in a different classroom other than where the class normally takes place. And one of those reasons is that students, while they're in the classroom learning the materials, are making associations. So they're making an association between the clock that was presented on the wall and the clock that was presented on the previous slide. So here I presented to you this idea of the clock associated with being long-term memory and how long is really long. And then you look at the clock that's on the wall and you say to yourself, oh, that's interesting. You know, we have a clock and it looks a lot like the clock that's there. So if you're in the same classroom as where you learned that specific information, and now I'm giving you a question about how long-term memory works, you may look at the clock and be like, oh, I remember that totally there was a clock in the slide when they talked about long-term memory and about how long that long is actually, or how long is long, which was what the idea was behind the clock. So here, using cues from the environment may actually be more helpful to be able to learn information. So here, really making those associations between the information that we're learning and the situation that you're in. So can music do this? Potentially. Now again, one of the things you want to try to avoid is using up the same resource as what it is that you're trying to use in that particular case. So in other words, you don't want to use music that has lyrics and then also reading information and studying for an exam, because they're competing for the same resource of auditory attention, in this particular case with the phonological loop and working memory. So here you may want to avoid that. But for instance, you may want some soft classical music or music that doesn't have very distracting beats, or even music that doesn't have distracting words that may function in terms of helping you remember some information or may even learn information associated with the beat or the melody associated with the song. And that may help you later on, that you say, oh yeah, I totally remember that it was this particular song that I was listening to, and that helped me remember that specific information. So encoding specificity is very important for us because it's trying to increase the likelihood of us accurately retrieving information. So you're making these associations. So even though you may not specifically remember exact information about a word or about an idea, maybe retrieving something that's similar to it is going to be able to help you along those lines. And here we're going to go through an example of this when I show you some results of one of our participation points that we've actually done. Now, many times we're going to find that there are going to be problems that may exist when trying to retrieve information, because granted, we put stuff in, right? We put stuff into your flash drive, into your hard drive, but now the problem is sometimes getting that information out. Now, whenever it is, again, we look at this idea of the perceptual process in terms of our systems here, again, remember we have our environmental stimulus, we have sensory registry that occurs first. We may have decay occur, so in other words, we lose information associated with that stimulus, and the stimulus may lose its physical properties too quickly, or for instance, we may potentially become distracted and we may move to something else, so ultimately I didn't process the information and pay any attention. At the working memory and short-term memory stage here, hopefully what I should be doing is really rehearsing on that information with my phonological loop, really making sure that I encode the correct information or potentially recode once I take information back out. That's why I have the backwards arrow pointing from long-term to short-term. And then once we put information into long-term memory, hopefully we should process, store, and recall information. But yet, at the short-term memory spot and also at the long-term memory spot, we may have some issues. At the short-term memory spot, we may potentially have some displacement occur. And remember, with displacement, essentially here we have faulty storage or retrieval that's potentially occurring. So in other words, you're not accessing the right information, or potentially the way that you stored the information may also be wrong. Now, at the long-term memory stage, what may potentially be happening here? We may suffer from interference. So again, proactive or retroactive interference, where information that we are learning may interfere with the information we already had, or information that we already had may potentially be affecting information that we're currently learning in this particular situation. Now, if we look at the aspect of decay, how does decay really work? Essentially here, one of the things that we would really like to do is try to work on the information and keep the stimulus present as much as possible. So that way I have a lot of time to be able to process information associated with it. But unfortunately, many times, especially out in nature, the event happens or the stimulus occurs, and then we need to work on that information a little bit later on. So sometimes what may potentially happen is that the event occurs or the stimulus occurs, and there's lots of time between when it is that I may actually need to retrieve information. So I may have seen the stimulus, I may have learned the information associated with it, but you know what? Such a long time occurs between when it is that I actually need to retrieve that information that I may have some problems. Or I may also have issues with the physical stimulus. The physical stimulus may have occurred too rapidly in nature, and I didn't give myself enough time to process the stimulus that was actually existing there. So since I don't have more processing time occurring, I may potentially have issues getting the information into working or short-term memory. So thus, I'm probably not even going to get to that point in that instance. So now, also with decay, we also see the idea of what Ebbinghaus presented to us, that we see this very famous forgetting curve, right? So that the longer it is that we actually extend out between when it is that we're trying to retrieve information that we learned previously, it's going to be a lot harder for us to be able to accurately recall that information. So in other words, retrieve that information in those specific points. Now, the second issue that we may encounter is the issue of displacement. Now, with the issue of displacement, again, we may potentially have this aspect of forgetting, right? So, quote unquote, forgetting. And we may potentially have faulty storage or retrieval existing at this point. So, in other words, we may potentially have information being put in incorrectly into the hard drive, or we may potentially be retrieving the wrong file. So here, ultimately, we don't want to do that. We actually want to have the right information being put in the right location with the right parameters associated with it. And then once we retrieve it, we want to make sure that we retrieve the right information as well. A lot of this is going to be dependent on the limitations associated with short-term memory capacity. That if we're presenting to you more information than what it is that you can handle, that 7 plus or minus 2 units, you may potentially now end up creating faulty storage because you're going to just start making things up or trying to make associations, trying to get as much information as you possibly can. Now, we may also suffer from some aspects associated with interference, so we're going to visit with interference in just a second here. And we may sometimes have to change our retrieval cues or the context. So in certain situations, if I'm in a different situation other than the one that I learned the information in, it may be hard for me to retrieve the information. So again, looking at this aspect of encoding specificity, you learned the material in classroom A, but now you're taking the exam in classroom B. Well, here, since the context or the situation changed, the cues change, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to retrieve that information because there's some mismatches between the context and the information that you were learning in that specific situation. Now, the last thing here that we're going to talk about in terms of problems is the issue of interference. Now, with interference, again, we have two types of interference. The first type is what we call proactive interference. And with proactive interference, we cannot retrieve information because previous information is interfering. So in other words, we have problems retrieving information because what you learned before is getting in the way. So in other words, if we look here at the little schematic that we have up here, you learned first the name Julie, and the second name you learned was Judy. So here, now you retrieve Julie out because that's the one you learned first, and you say Julie instead of Judy in this particular case. So in other words, you also learned Judy, but you say Julie first because that's the first one that you actually learned. So the older information is hindering your retrieval of the newer information in this particular case. Now, with retroactive interference, you cannot retrieve information because the later information is interfering. So in other words, now we have Judy interfering with the name Julie in this particular case. So in other words, what you learned afterwards is interfering with what you're trying to retrieve that occurred first. So in other words, what you learned after is getting in the way of the very first thing that you learned. So here, learning Judy second is now interfering with you learning Julie in this particular case. So these are all issues that we may potentially consider that are very, very important and detrimental to our ability to accurately retrieve information. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this next week, since we're going to spend a lot more time talking about long-term memory, and we'll have lots of other examples associated with this, and we'll try out a couple of examples as well. Now, just some other issues to possibly consider as well, and some that we've already actually encountered this semester. You just may not even be actually have known that we encounter some of these. The very first thing here that we may encounter is the issue of serial position effect. Now, this may sound very, very familiar because we actually did this earlier in the semester, about 2 weeks ago, that we had one of our participation points being this issue of the primacy and recency effect. That actually refers to the idea of the serial position effect. And what does the serial position effect predict? That the recall of words at the beginning or the end of a list are going to be recalled better than the words in the middle. So here we're going to end up having what are called the primacy and the recency effects. The primacy effect is associated with remembering information that occurs very, very early on in the list. With the recency effect is remembering later items better. So in other words, we're going to remember information that occurred at the end of the list pretty well as well also. So in other words, the information that we learn at the beginning and the information that we learn at the end is going to be what we learn the best and what we recall the best. Why does that happen? What are the explanations? Well, the explanations are the following. For the primacy effect, ultimately here what you're doing is you're rehearsing. So when we presented the list of words to you, and I'll see here if I have my results. Oh, here we go. Here are our results, and I'll come back to those other points in just a second here. So if we look here at our results, at the bottom on the x-axis, I actually have the words that occurred in order. On the y-axis, now we have the number of responses in terms of the class. If I remember correctly, in terms of the class size, I think we have 25 students total, if I remember correctly, or 25 or 23 students, if I remember correctly at this point. So one of the things that we find is very interesting. So you'll notice here that we demonstrate the primacy and recency effect with the in-class participation that we had. So if we look back here at the results given to us by primacy and recency, you'll notice that our results look a lot like the blue line that's being given to you here. So in other words, when we gave you 0 seconds delay between when it is that you actually looked at the words to when we asked you to write them down, ultimately here we see that function occurring, that very nice U-shaped curve, or what we call the serial position effect. Now, in terms of the serial position effect, what do we find here? We find that the information at the beginning of the list recalled better. And again, why does that happen in our particular case? Because we're rehearsing the information. So when we presented the information to you, what did you do? You said bed, and then rest came up and you said bed, rest awake, tired, bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, and you kept trying to rehearse those as much as you could. So what are you doing? You're keeping them in your phonological loop, your articulatory loop here specifically, where you're trying to keep that information in and continuously repeating that information over and over and over again. But then look what happens when we start getting to about 5 and 6 words. So bed is 1, rest is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you'll notice what starts happening. Our performance starts decreasing again, just as what was predicted by George Miller, 7 plus or minus 2. That once we start getting beyond that 5, getting to 6, 7, and 8, we start seeing decreases occurring in terms of our ability to accurately recall that information. Why? Because now all of a sudden we have too much information that we're trying to juggle and keep up with. So what ends up happening? You continuously are still going through bed, rest, awake, tired, dream. You're still doing those and you're rehearsing them. And as you're continuously rehearsing them, the longer that you're doing that, the more likely it is that it's going to be sent over into long-term memory. So you kept them active in working memory. They got sent over to long-term memory. And now the list in the middle starts decreasing. So if you notice, lots of individuals, we go from having 16, 17, 18 individuals responding to the words at the beginning of the list to all of a sudden now having 6 individuals responding to blanket, 7 individuals responding to doze that are right in the middle of the list. And then what happens towards the end of the list? We have the recency effect. Those are recalled also very, very well because of the following reason. Those are the ones that are still maintained in active processing. In other words, I'm still rehearsing those as well, but I'm continuously maintaining those. So in other words, I still have those in short-term memory. I'm still working on them. So here, why do I recall the ones at the beginning? Because those are the ones I'm retrieving from long-term memory. Why do I remember the ones towards the end? Because those are the ones that I'm currently keeping active. So here, very, very important results. Now here, one other interesting result that we do see, you'll notice the very, very last word that we have there, sleep. Now you'll notice that lots of you answered that you reported sleep. Why did this happen? Well, the first thing that we have to think of is, well, because it happened in the list. You guys clicked on it because you assumed that it happened in the list. In reality, sleep was never presented to you in that list. So here, one of the things that we find very quickly with a very basic experiment and using just our online resources that we have available, we found the following result. that 18 individuals, just about 18 out of about 23 or 24 individuals this semester, responded that they saw a word that did not exist. So here, this is actually a false memory. So here, why does that happen? There's a very good explanation as to why this happens. Sleep, as you can imagine, is the overall larger category associated with all of these words, right? So that's the similarity that are between all of them. So here's bed, here's rest, here's awake. Got pillow somewhere in there, don't I? No, I don't have pillow. I thought, you see, I made a false memory and I said pillow. Yawn, etc. So all of these are words that are revolving around this semantic category of sleep. So here when I asked you, did you see sleep? Lots of you responded yes, because to you it actually looked like a possible reason. And here many of you wrote down sleep on your list because to you, again, you were saying, well, out of all these words, I had to have seen sleep. Maybe some of you guys even wrote down pillow. And you're probably like, I wrote down pillow and pillow wasn't even on the list, so was I wrong there? Yeah, you're wrong. But why? Because again, pillow is also a word that's similar to these. So in this particular case, what is happening? We are essentially making associations, and this is actually the way that memories work. That here we activate information, and then that activation of information leads us to other words that are potentially also available to us. We call this theory the spreading activation theory. So spreading activation. And what spreading activation theory proposes for us is it proposes that once we activate one piece of the puzzle, or one node, as they're called in our particular theory, and each one of these items here is what we would call a node. So once it is that we actually activate one of these nodes, it starts spreading, and it starts activating other things that are relevant to it. So in other words, once we saw awake, it activated sleep. We saw rest, it activated sleep. Bed, it activated sleep. And since all of these are activating the category of sleep, to you it seemed reasonable that sleep should be in the list. So even though some of you may have potentially not written sleep down on your list, when you saw sleep on the list of what I gave you, and I said, did you see sleep? Many of you probably clicked yes anyways because you were like, man, I totally did see it, but I didn't remember it until I saw it that it was on the list. And here I didn't. And here, if you don't believe me, you can totally go back to that week's participation point, and you can look at the PowerPoint again to see if sleep's in the list. And I guarantee you, I have not made any modifications to that. I've done this easily 100 times, guys, in class presentations, and every time I find people reporting that they see sleep. Never in such quantities as I have here, I will tell you that. So that was interesting that I had over 18 people responding that they saw sleep in this particular example of ours. But normally I always have about 5 or 6 people, even in a class of 30 or 40 people, that see sleep. And they always are baffled. Everyone's always baffled. I know I saw sleep. And you'll go back, and I promise you probably will do this if you wrote down sleep, that you'll go back to that presentation and you'll see that sleep is not there. And I promise you I have not made any modifications to it. So in our particular case, with primacy and recency effect, we see those kinds of results, that we see early items being recalled better because we have the rehearsal. Recency, we have later items being recalled because those are the ones that we're keeping in our active memory. And many of you probably even on your list of words, either you wrote down the words that you saw at the beginning of the list or you wrote down the words that you saw at the end of the list first. And most of the time, you write down what you saw at the end of the list first because those are the ones that you have in your active memory and you're able to jot those down faster, and then you go back to trying to retrieve the ones from the beginning of the list. Now, the last issues here that I wanted to mention here is the issues of modality effects. One of the interesting issues that we have to consider is how we present information. A very interesting finding that we've seen throughout the literature, throughout the research in cognitive psychology, is that if we present information in auditory versus visual processing, we find that there tends to be some issues with how it is that we recall information. Generally, we tend to recall about the same, but then we start seeing some minor differences that may potentially occur towards the later ends of some of the information that we're presenting. We even see some delays that may exist in some potential issues. Now, in conclusion, just to kind of wrap up our lecture for today, what does this all mean for us? Well, it essentially means that working memory is a very necessary component for us to transfer information. It essentially is the bridge that we're looking for between STM to LTM. So in other words, we want to make sure that the information that we're looking at outside in the world gets through the sensory registry, it gets into short-term memory so we don't have any decay. It gets into short-term memory. What we put in now is going to be actively worked on by working memory, and it's going to transfer that information over into long-term memory correctly. Is there a guarantee of correctly? And the answer is no, because a lot of that is going to be dependent on attention, encoding, and your retrieval practices. So here, depending on those potential factors, we're going to notice that there's going to be lots of changes in the information that we're processing. All right, that wraps up our discussion for this week. I hope you all enjoyed our discussion associated with working memory. I really like talking about memory, and next week I'm very excited that we're going to be able to talk a little bit also about long-term memory. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, have a good rest of your week, guys, and please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Feel free to email me or call me.